Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Anya Anti. Thank you so much for being here today. And I would like to introduce myself a little bit. I'm a fine and conceptual photographer and storytelling photo artist. And I specialize in on-location surrealistic female portraiture with surreal and whimsical twists. And I'm also a professional retoucher. As a fine art photographer and photo artist, my approach to photography is a little bit different. I try to go beyond traditional portraiture and create something that is not possible to capture in camera. So that's why I heavily rely on props, costumes, set design, and of course, Photoshop manipulations. And I strongly believe that interesting art requires more than just taking a picture. I believe that post-production is essential to finalize a work because just like a camera, editing software is a powerful tool for creating artwork. Because with it, you can fix small issues you might have overlooked on location. You can match everything to your vision and make sure that everything looks the way you planned it. And of course, bring your work to the next level. So today, I would like to share my approach to editing and show my creative portrait retouching workflow. So today, I would like to break down this image and show you how I created from start to finish, from this to this. So a little bit about this picture I created a few years ago, and I wanted to play around this idea of replacing my subject's eye with like fake flower with an eyeball inside. And I really love how this fake flower matches with the background flowers. I thought it was really cool. So all my work is square format. It's just a personal preference. That's what I always do. So I took this picture first, and if you think about it, I could, of course, crop it to square, but in this case, the head would be right in the middle, and this is not a very good thing to do because it would create a floating head effect. So when you do like a central composition and square format like I do, try to place your eyes on like third top part of the image. So that would be like best way to do it in terms of composition. And for this image, I really wanted to get more of that swirly bokeh behind her and to emphasize the surroundings and do like central composition and, but the thing was with this shoot that I was in very tight space. I shot it on Highline Park. If everybody ever been there, it's like very narrow pathway with a lot of people walking by. So I couldn't really step back. So what I decided to do, I decided to take two separate shots. So I decided to take top part and then the bottom part and then stitch them together in Photoshop. So I took this picture. And we're going to create one seamless image later in Photoshop. And this is my raw image, 2 raw files. And I always start with, of course, processing raw files. I do raw processing in Lightroom. So now I need to open these 2 images in Lightroom. And I use Adobe Bridge to browse my images. It's just, I like to organize my file first, make selects, group them, put them maybe in folders. Just visually works better for me. So I simply click, select my images. I click and drag them into Lightroom. It's already opened. And just release the click to import. And here you go. Here I have like import menu. My images are already checked, and I click import. OK, they should be here. Here are my 2 files. And now I go to develop mode to process them. I usually start by processing my raw files in basic menu. So here's my basic menu. And I prefer cooler tones on my images, so I usually tweak temperature first. And for this image, I would like to lower it to like 5,000 degrees temperature and move my tint a little bit. Then I like to expand my dynamic range by reducing highlights, like that, and increasing shadows. So this way it gives me more details in shadows and less, maybe, overexposed things in highlights. I would like to add a little bit dehaze to add a subtle contrast. And that's pretty much it. That's what I usually do in basic menu. Then I move to curves. In tone curves, I prefer doing kind of like an S-curve, but a little bit different, not like a classical S-curve. I do two points on the curve, just like that, with a little bit of, oops, no, Control Z to go back. Just a tiny bit of contrast. But what I prefer doing is, I like to create faded effect. And to do that, I bring my black point up, just like that, maybe a little bit more. And my white point down. And this kind of created this subtle faded effect, because when I was starting out, I was very much inspired by film photography. And you know, when you do film, it can do this like faded blacks and whites. So this is just what I like to do. If you click before and after, you can see the effect. And sometimes I play with channels and curves. So for this specific image, I would like to go to blue channel and add just a tiny bit of blue in the shadows by bringing my black point up and dragging my midtones down, because opposite to blue is yellow when we work in RGB space, so that makes my midtones just a tiny bit more yellow. Okay, let's see the before and after. Just a very subtle change. And then I move to HSL. HSL is a very powerful tool, I guess you can call it a tool. And this is where, let me collapse this. And this is where most of my color edits happen. I match everything to a specific color scheme. I play with, you know, hues and saturations of different colors. And for this specific image, I wanted to create a cyan and orange, like teal and orange color scheme, which are two complementary colors. And to do that, I need to make sure that all my purples, cyans, teals, and blues on this image kind of match together in one color. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to slightly make my oranges, this is where usually skin tones live, so I make them slightly less yellow. And then in yellows, which is mostly everything that is green on my image, I don't want any green because, again, this is a teal and orange color scheme, so I want to kill all the greens. But I'm going to slightly move my yellows to the left to make them more orange, I guess. And in greens, I'm going to almost completely desaturate them and make them a little bit darker, like that. Now I'm going to move to aqua. This is where my fake flower lives. And I'm going to move its hue all the way to the right, like that. Slightly decrease saturation, and slightly lighten it, like that. Oops, that was not aqua, sorry, that was a blue color. Let's reset that. So in aqua color, move all the way to the right, decrease saturation, slightly lighten it. And in blue, I'm going to do kind of opposite. Move them more towards cyan colors, like that. And my flowers, they live in the purple color, so I'm going to move its hue slider all the way to the left to make them blue. And sometimes I touch magenta because usually that's where all the chromatic aberrations live. So I just prefer to slightly make them more like red towards skin tones and desaturate them. But that's not really necessary, but that's what I usually do. So if you see me before and after, this is what I got with an HSL. I like to color grade my images just slightly, and I usually go to my shadows and I like to tone them into a warm color like orange, something like that, with a little bit of saturation. Let's do 6 is okay. And I like to tone my highlights into cooler tones, something like that, and bring saturation something like there. There's no rule there, there's no like science behind it, it's just my personal preference to tone my images that way. That's what I do most of the times. Okay, and the last menu that I usually touch in Lightroom is camera calibration. In camera calibration, again, there's no really a rule. I just play around with these sliders and see what I like. So let me bring up my sliders and see what I've done like before and after here. The blue slider is pretty cool because it creates this kind of like, again, if we move it all the way to the left, it creates this kind of like two colored images in a way. So I usually bring the blue hue like that, like around 30. And add a little bit of saturation to it. So if we click on before and after, you can see how camera calibration allows me to make my colors pop more and kind of like unify my colors even more towards that teal and orange color scheme that I'm trying to achieve. Okay, and that's pretty much it. So, but I have two images, right? So I need to synchronize them. And the easiest way to do this is to, because I have only two images, to click on this image, and here at the bottom of the menu you can see a previous button. So I just click on that, and that copies all the settings that I did from the previous image to the image that I'm currently on. And that's it. So now I need to export my images. And usually I have a whole set from my photo shoot, like maybe 100 or 200 images, so I synchronize them all and export them all, rather than exporting just one select image, because in that way I can, if I need to, if I feel like I need to swap something, let's say like swap an arm or like a piece of hair, I have all my images from all the set and I can steal different pieces from different images to make some edits, if that makes sense. So what I do to export is I hit on Shift key on my keypad, select all these images that I have down here, right click and go to Export with 3 dots. And it brings me to the Export menu. And in the Export menu, I like to keep my export to the same folder as the original image because that's why I know where exactly my images are going to be located later in the image browser. And I like it to put it like in subfolder, and you can name it however you want. Normally, I skip file naming, I don't need to rename, I don't do video, so I skip those, and I go straight to file settings. In file settings, what I normally do when I work with my images, I export them in TIFF. And I prefer choosing Adobe RGB color space because it's a wider color space, it's better to work with. And I prefer to choose 16-bit versus 8-bit because, again, it's better image quality, but unfortunately, 16-bit requires more computer power. So for the sake of this tutorial today, because I'm working on a laptop, not a like powerful desktop computer, I'm going to export in JPEG. And for this, again, for this tutorial, when you export in JPEG, I recommend choosing sRGB because this is the space where all images live on the internet. Like all your browsers, social media, website, they all work in sRGB color space. And I choose maximum quality. So when I export in TIFF, I would name my subfolder TIFF, but right now, again, for the sake of this tutorial, I'm exporting it in JPEG, so I'm calling my subfolder JPEG. Makes sense. And again, I don't need any image resizing. The only thing that I do is I choose my resolution as 300 pixels per inch, and I click export. And here on the top, you can see the process of exporting. It might take a few minutes. Oh, there you go. So now if I go back to my image browser, here is my JPEG folder, and here are my 2 images. So now I'm going to proceed in Photoshop. Like I said before, I did 2 separate images, like top and the bottom of my potential frame. So now I need to stitch them together. So again, to open my files in Photoshop, I prefer doing it from the browser. And I select them like this, and click and drag, and just drop them in Photoshop. Here are 2 of my images. You can see them here in the tab. So now what I do to stitch my images together, I use panorama option in Photoshop. To find it, you need to go to File, Automate, Photo Merge. And I usually start with Auto function and see if it works. So I click on Add Open Files and click OK. And Photoshop is going to automatically stitch these two images for me. There you go. We can now close these two. We don't need them anymore. You can see Photoshop created two different layers in the layer panel out of those two images, and it masked them already. So I think it looks pretty good. The auto function, the Photo Merge, did a really good job. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. So yeah, I just need to crop now. And like I said before, my work is always square ratio, it's just my personal preference. So I take crop tool, and here in the options panel, you can choose your ratio, however you need it. You can choose like 4:5, 16:9 for video, but I choose 1:1 square. And I crop it. I don't really need this hand down here, so I'm just going to crop it like that. And when you crop, I highly recommend unchecking the delete cropped pixels box, because otherwise, if you check it, it's going to delete everything you cropped out beyond this crop like square bar. So we don't want that, because we want our editing to be as non-destructive as possible. We want to keep all the information possible, because I don't know, I might change my mind and I want to maybe later to expand my crop a little bit, but if I crop out my pixels, I won't be able to do that. So I never check this box. And I click OK. Okay, and then I move on to retouching. To do that, I need to do a copy merge of these two layers, and to do that, I hit Alt, Control, or Command on PC, Shift, and E on your keypad, and it creates, you can see in the history panel, stamp visible, so it created kind of merged copy on top of everything. In the layer panel, it's layer 1. So now I can proceed. I always like to start with shaping, which is liquify filter. And for liquify filter, I usually fix small issues like maybe clothing, something sticks out, maybe fixing like seams, making them more straight. Maybe like there's a weird hair. Sometimes I like to do like curls, give them better like wavy shape. So let's go to liquify, which is under filter, liquify. And I'm going to do some shaping. Here you go. So here, like you see here on the coat, the sleeve sticks out a little bit, like there's a bump. I don't like it, so I'm going to move it. I'm using a forward warp tool, and what it does, it basically takes pixels and move them around. So I click and drag to slightly reduce that bump on the coat. And I'm going to give a little bit better shape for her curls and hair, like there's a bump of hair sticking out. Let me actually grab my pen tablet. So I just, like move the curls a little bit to give them better shape like that. And you also can fix some flyaways like that, like on the top of her hair. So for that, I'm gonna actually take a pucker tool, which essentially it squeezes pixels to the center, making a part of an image smaller. So here in the top, I just click, and you see it kind of squeezes this like weird flyaways on the top of hair and reduces them. And I'm going back to forward warp tool. Of course, you can, do changes to your subject's face and body if you want to, but it kind of raises an ethical question, right? If we want to, change person's body. So, I mean, it's up to you. But I always recommend doing very subtle changes and keep person recognizable. I mean, I know some people like making noses and smaller, eyes bigger. Of course, you can do that. I think she's already beautiful, so I'm not touching her face. But maybe like fixing her jawline just a tiny bit like that. But just make sure you do very subtle changes, not going overboard with that. But we can always fix hair, that's fine. I think so. Okay, I think that's it, and I click OK. Takes a moment to process. There you go. If we click this layer 1 on and off, we can see very subtle changes that I did, kind of like making her hair like neater a little bit. I think it's good. Okay, let's proceed. Then I proceed with retouching. So I always prefer working with pixels, like shaping and retouching, and then working with adjustments on top of that. Oops. So for retouching, I usually like to create 3 different layers, empty layers down here at the bottom of the layer panel. And one layer I'm going to keep in normal mode. Another layer I'm going to put in lighten mode. So if you're not familiar with blending modes, lighting mode keeps everything on the current layer that is lighter than the layer below it, if it makes sense. So everything that is lighter on this layer is going to stay visible, that everything that is darker is going to be invisible. And the darker blending mode is the opposite to that. Everything that is darker on this current layer, darker than the layer below, is going to keep visible, and vice versa. I'm going to show you what I'm going to do that. Let's zoom in. So for example, all these flyaway hairs, they are pretty bright. And what I want to do is basically to cover with them with darker pixel from other parts of the hair. And I think like the darker mode in this specific case will work really great because we're going to cover those like bright hairs with darker pixels from other parts of the hair. And to do that, I really like working with spot healing brush because I don't need to click Alt all the time and select my source. I just basically brush over this little hair, and Photoshop automatically analyzes all this area surroundings and does the job for me and covers the hair. So I'm going to quickly paint over these like bright flyaway hairs. I'm not going to do all the hair because unfortunately we don't have the time. The time is limited for this class, but I'm just hoping to give you an idea about what I'm doing. So I think darken mode, like this, I'm working on an empty layer with darken mode. And when I'm working with spot healing brush, I make sure that I have sample all layers checked because I'm working on an empty layer which doesn't have any pixels. So Photoshop needs to pick up pixels from all the layers, the whole image. Okay, so if we click on and off, we can see what we did. So this kind of work requires quite some time and patience. But in the end, you can really fix like flyaway hairs and things like that. And I can switch between different tools. Like I can pick up healing brush and remove this really bright piece of hair like that. And also, I don't like these piece of hair, but darken mode won't work in this case because this is kind of dark. So if I is going to cover them, this piece of hair with darker pixel is not quite going to work. So I think the normal mode will work here better. Like that. So doing retouching on separate layers, first of all, makes my editing, again, non-destructive because I'm keeping everything separate. Plus, creating these 3 layers gives me more control because I can decide if, like, for example, this little weird bright part, you know, because, for example, if you remove a pimple consists of 2 different parts, a darker part, which is shadow, and a lighter part because, you know, it, goes up. So instead of just removing it with one swipe of a healing brush, doing it separately, removing the dark part and then removing the light part, it gives me more control. So for example, these things on the forehead, they're quite dark, so I'm going to lighten mode. I'm going to select spot healing brush. And I'm going to remove only dark spots first, and then see if I really need to remove anything that is bright left, like there. I hope it makes sense. So in the lighten mode layer, in the lighting mode, I'm removing anything that is dark. And then I can switch between these layers and go back to the layer in the darken mode and now remove everything that I think is too bright. Like there's a weird thing going on with the fake flower, and I go to a layer with a normal mode and just see if Photoshop can remove it for me with a spot healing brush. Okay, I think it looks good. I can also choose clone stamp tool to lighten this under eye dark circle. And I recommend not removing these things completely because, you know, human face have different things going on. So dark circles and just under eye area, it's pretty natural. So I recommend not removing it completely, but we can always lighten it and make it less, less prominent. And to do that, I'm going into lighting mode layer. I'm going to select my clone stamp tool and reduce its opacity like that. Let me make sure that the hardness is 0. So it's a very soft brush. See what is happening here? You can see a dark spot, and that's because right here in the darken mode, I already removed something bright. But that's okay. That's why I'm keeping all my layers separate and my editing non-destructive. That's fine. I can always, take an eraser tool and just remove it. Oops, nope, clone stamp tool. And I'm lightening this dark circle. Again, if you notice, I'm not removing it completely because otherwise it won't look natural. And if I think that I overdid something, that's fine. I can always, adjust my layer, erase something, reduce opacity, and things like that. I'm going to slightly lighten this area. And of course, just letting you know that there are multiple ways in Photoshop that you can do different things. There's no one correct way to do things in Photoshop. It's just, things of a personal preference, your experience, and your level in Photoshop. So somebody would maybe say to me, oh, why don't you lighten those areas with curves, for example, curves? And that's totally fine. You can, of course, do that, but it's just the way I prefer doing it because I already have these 3 layers for retouching. And sometimes I use this method even kind of like imitate a dodge and burn technique, which people do a little bit differently. You usually do it with a curve or a gray layer, but sometimes I do this with this darken and lighten layers, and like I'm taking my clone stamp tool with a really low opacity, like 10%, and slightly going over dark areas. Okay. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because, otherwise I would spend maybe like 30 minutes on that. But unfortunately, we don't have that time. But I hope you get the idea. We can group them. What I did is just select it with the Shift key and hit Control G to group and kind of see the before and after. Okay. Let's proceed. So now what I would like to do is, here you can see on the fake hair bearer, I used this fake plastic eyeball, and what I did, I basically took some sticky foam and attached it to the flower, so you can see pieces of foam sticking out, which is not, pretty. We need to fix that. We need to remove that. And I also want my fake eyeball to cover the yellow center completely. And of course, you can take like, clone stamp tool or healing brush or whatever and do that with those tools. But what I would do in this instance is I would do it a little bit differently. I would take a elliptical marquee tool, and I'm going to select the eyeball like that. So while I'm selecting with the marquee tool, I hit space bar to kind of like relocate my selection without releasing the click. And then I release the space bar and I continue adjusting my selection. And now I'm releasing the click and my selection is ready. So now I'm going to copy this part that I've selected to a new layer. And I just hit Control J to make a copy, and I've made a copy based on my selection. So now if you turn everything off, I only have the eyeball. I'm going to move it up. And I'm going to hit Control T for free transformation. And just scale it up, covering everything that I don't need, like a flower center and the glue. And click OK. You can see a little bit of the yellow edge around the eyeball. And again, there's an easy way to remove that. I'm going to hold Control key, and click on this eyeball layer, and it's going to load a selection based on the pixels of this layer. And I'm going to apply a mask. So now a mask is applied based on that selection. And you don't see any changes yet, but here's the mask, and here's my eyeball layer. But now what I can do is I can click on the mask and go to Filter, Other, and Minimum. And what it does, it basically reduces the size of my mask by the amount of pixels radius that I select. So I can do like 1 pixel radius, or let's do 3. Okay. And this is what it did. And I didn't erase anything. I basically covered it with my mask. So this is my mask. And if I turn off my mask by holding Shift and clicking on my mask, this is without the mask. And I feel like I want to scale my eyeball a little bit more. So again, free transformation. And I'm covering everything that was underneath it, like that. It still looks a little bit fake, so I want to add a little bit more of like flower petals around it to kind of like hide this very hard edge. So I'm going to create new empty layer on top, choose Clone Stamp tool. Let's do 100% opacity. And I'm going to clone these little petals from the flower and kind of like paint and add them here. It doesn't have to be perfect. I can always adjust it with either a mask or an eraser tool. Like that. And now with an eraser tool, I'm slightly fixing the shape. Like that. And I want these petals to pop up a little bit more. And that's why I want to make them brighter. And there are two ways to do that. You can either go to image adjustments and apply, like something like curves straight to the layer, like that. But this is a pretty destructive way of doing things, because if you apply this curves adjustment on top of, pixel layer, it's going to be a very permanent change. So if, for example, you save file, close it, and then open it up, you won't be able to do any changes to this adjustment. That's why I always use adjustment layers, and they are here at the bottom of the layer panel, or you can find them in layer. I think they should be here. Adjustments. Here we go, new adjustment layer. So I'm going to go to my adjustment layers and select a curve. And now you have this adjustment on top of everything as a separate layer. You can turn it on and off. It already comes with mask, and you can, do a change and then save your file, close it, open up in a week or month or a year, and still be able to do any changes and tweaks you want. But here's the thing, because my adjustment curves is on top of everything, and when I do any changes to it, you can see that it affects the whole image, right? Because it's kind of like on top of everything. But we want this adjustment to only affect this little layer with little flower petals. And to do that, we need to create a clipping mask. And there are two ways, I think three ways to do that. You can either, here in the properties panel, you can either click on this little icon here, and you can see an arrow, like little icon appeared in the layer panel, meaning that now this layer curve is clipped to the layer number 6, which is flower petals. Or you can hold Alt key and bring your mouse cursor between the layers, and you can see a little icon of a square with an arrow appeared, and you click between the layers, and now those two layers are clipped together. So now when we do any changes to the curve, it only affects this layer. And this is very, very helpful. So I'm just going to drag my master layer up to brighten this piece slightly, like that. You see how it brings this, it gives more layers to the flower. And I think I would like to add a little bit of a shadow. So I'm going to create another curve layer, but this time I'm going to move it behind, kind of behind my petals layer, so underneath it. Drag it down. Hit Control-I to invert the mask, make it black. Take white brush tool. Let's do opacity like something like 50% and paint where I want my shadow to be. Because when we work with mask, white color reveals and black color hides. Like that. If you didn't know, you can apply filters to the mask. So for example, I want my mask be, here's my mask. To view your mask, you hold Alt key and click on the mask. To go back to the image, again, hold Alt key and click again on the mask. So you can see that it's not very feathered enough. So I would like to feather it more. And to do that, I can go to filter and just apply Gaussian blur to the mask. To make it more feathered, there's the mask. And if you increase the pixel radius, you can see it makes it, blurred and feathered. I think something like that is good. Okay. Okay, I think I'm done with the flower. It looks pretty good. So next, what I would like to do here on this image, if you take a look at the background, it looks fine. There are flowers, there's swirly bokeh, but I feel like some spots are kind of missing flowers. And I want to add more of those. For example, like here in the corner, or maybe down here behind the subject. And to do that, I'm going to create another empty layer. And I'm going to use Clone Stamp tool. And just basically copy some of these flowers here. But here's the cool thing about Clone Stamp tool. If you go to Window, it should be Clone Source. Here in the Clone Source Properties menu, you can do all sorts of things to Clone Stamp. You can change it. You can rotate it and change the angle. You can click this button and flip it horizontally, and things like that. So because I have a swirly bokeh, sorry. If you take a look, it kind of does this, circular movement in the background, right? So when cloning my flowers to the rest of the background, I want to keep that effect. I want to continue that swirly, circular effect. So to do that, instead of just, taking Clone Stamp and painting, I'm going to change its rotation. I'm going to, let's say, take these flowers here and change the rotation here, the angle of the Clone Stamp tool. So now when I clone, when I paint, you can see that it's, the same flowers, but they are slightly rotated. Let's move this menu here. And again, for example, I want to clone these flowers down here, so I move the rotation the other way. Something like that. Nope, no, it was wrong direction. Even more, I need even more angle. There you go. You see how it's rotated, tilted? And I just keep painting and adding a little bit of flowers. Let's do this side. We can actually take these flowers from here, reset the angle by clicking this icon, and flip them horizontally. There you go. Let's remove the flip thing button and copy these flowers down here, but I need to rotate them like that. Here's the before and after. I think it makes a difference. It makes the image kind of like fuller, the background. Okay, and I think I'm done with my editing part, and I want to move on a little bit to adjustments and make slight changes to color, contrast, and just play around with some adjustment layers. So I would like to brighten up her face a little bit, and I'm going to apply a curves adjustment layer. Let me move the options panel, properties panel, so you can see the image. There you go. But instead of just dragging the curve up, I want to also add a little bit more contrast. And I'm going to pull the shadows down like that. But I only want this layer to be on her face, so I'm going to hit Control-I to invert the mask. Take white brush with low opacity. With square brackets, I'm increasing the size of a brush, maybe a little bit more opacity. And paint only on her face. Like that. Now I want to brighten up her eye a little bit, and again I'm creating another curve layer. I'm going to brighten it up, but I also want kind of make it bluer, the color of your iris a little bit bluer. So I'm going to channels, I'm going to red channel, and in RGB color space, opposite to red is cyan. So if we drag the red channel up, we add more red, but if we drag it down, we add more cyan to the image. And the same thing happens in all the three channels. So if we go to blue channel and drag it up, we add more blue, but opposite to blue is yellow. So if we drag it down, it's yellow. But I want more blue, so I drag it a little bit up. And again, I'm going to invert the mask. And with white brush tool, paint slightly, maybe that's too much. So I'm flipping the color X on your keyboard to switch between foreground and background color. And with black brush, brush it back. If I feel like maybe it's a little bit too much, and as a general rule of thumb, I always recommend reducing the opacity of adjustment layers to like 60–80% to avoid overdoing. Just a rule of thumb. Okay. I think it looks good. Couple of more final adjustments. Again, specifically for this image, I asked my model to wear a blue coat to, again, to create the teal and orange color scheme. But for my taste, it looks a little bit more teal rather than blue right now. So I want to change the hue of the coat slightly. To do that, I'm going to create a hue saturation adjustment layer. And go here in the pop-up menu down. I choose a specific color. The cool thing about hue saturation color, if you in the master and you change the hue, it changed the color of the hue of all your colors. But the cool thing about hue saturation that you have all these different color options that you can target specifically. So right now I want to specifically target a cyan color. So I select it, and now if I change the hue, it only applies to everything that is cyan. And I move the hue slightly to the right. And again, I'm going to invert the mask. And with my brush, paint, let's increase the opacity, paint over the coat. It's a very subtle change, but I think it kind of brings all the colors together. For doing more color effects and grading, I like to use gradient map. Here it is in adjustment layers. And gradient map allows us to tone images in a creative way. So what it does, it creates this gradient, and let's click on the gradient preview. And here on the left, where the shadows live. So this color, if we click on this square icon here, this is the color that tones our shadows. So right now I have white in my shadows and black in my highlights. That's why it creates this kind of inverse effect. But if we choose color for shadows and click on this icon, color for highlights, which is white, it's going to create this black and white effect. But instead of black and white, we can choose any color we want. For example, for this image, I want my shadows to be, I don't know, teal. And my highlights, let's say orange or yellow, like that. And then if I drag this slider towards the middle, it's going to kind of like shift the balance and add more of this color towards the midtones of the image, like that. And I would like to move the highlights color a little bit towards the middle to brighten this image a little bit, like that. And of course, you cannot keep the same. I mean, you can do whatever you want, but I recommend, and that's what I always do, is I don't keep it like this. I always change the blending mode and opacity. And I really like to use soft light mode for this effect, because it not only color grades the image, it also adds a little bit of contrast, and of course, reduce the opacity to like 20–30%. And another last adjustment that I would like to add, I really like to play with Shader Mixer. And this is a very underestimated adjustment. I don't see people using it a lot, but I think it adds, basically what it does, if you apply it, it creates a black and white image. And it's kind of like, so with this adjustment layer, I like to change the tonal contrast of the image. So let me show you what I mean by that. So here in the presets, there's a default, but there's these black and white that kind of like imitates black and white film. If any of you ever worked with black and white film, there's like infrared, and you can apply different filters, like infra blue filter, green filter, which changes the tonal range in black and white film photography. So this adjustment layer kind of imitates that effect, and when you select, for example, black and white infrared, you can see how it, brings all the blue colors towards white, and all the red colors, which is usually skin tone, kind of like makes them darker. And that creates a really cool effect. Let me show you. I usually like choosing blue filter because it's more subtle. And then what I do is I bring this layer into luminosity mode, which only keeps the luminosity and not the color. So now my image is not black and white anymore. It's colored, but luminosity blending mode kept the brightness of that layer, if that makes sense. And then I just reduced the opacity like that. And it kind of like shifted the tonal range, if that makes sense. And I just really love the effect, how it makes the subject pop more in a way. Okay, this is pretty much it. This is the final image. I can group these two layers, which was my panorama / merged two images merged together. Control G to group them, and I hold Alt key and I click on the eye icon to turn everything off, and keep this layer this group on to see the before and after. And again, I hold Alt key, click on the eye icon to turn everything back on. All right, and this is the final image. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if we have time for Q&A, but I guess we have. We have any questions? Sure.
save the file, do you flatten it or do you keep the whole file?
Oh yeah, great question. Of course, because of course we want our editing to be as non-destructive as possible, and that's why we work with layers and masks. That's why I always repeat, keep everything separate, your retouching layer separate, all the adjustments separate. Then of course we want to save all our layers. And you can imagine how many times in my career I needed that PSD file with all my layers to be able to go back and make changes and make tweaks. So of course I always, first of all, I go to File and Save As, and save it as PSD. Yeah, and yeah, so you can name it however you want. You know, like B&H, depth of field, whatever, and you save it with all those layers, yes.
Do you save it outside of Lightroom or do you save the whole file in Lightroom?
I'm not in Lightroom, I'm working in Photoshop.
Okay.
So I'm just saving my file on my hard drive. Let's say it's drive C. So yeah, I choose my folder and save it as a PSD, like that. Yes? I'm sorry, I don't hear you.
You have incredible mastery of this very complicated product. How did you acquire that?
Well, I've been doing photography over a decade now, and I actually started learning Photoshop before I started photography, because when I was in university, I was trying to decide what profession I want to acquire. So I thought maybe I would go to like web design or just, you know, visual design. So I started learning Illustrator and Photoshop. And I think that's when the digital photography became very popular. I got my first like little small digital camera, and I just wanted to improve my images. I wanted to add more contrast, make colors more saturated, and maybe like remove a pimple here and there. So that's how I started learning Photoshop. And yeah, it's been, I think it's been like 15 years maybe. So yeah, and I'm self-taught. I just learned everything online from like photography communities, tutorials, YouTube, articles. Well, there was no YouTube back then. It's been a while ago. But like articles, yeah, forums.
So when it comes to the next photos that you have from this shoot, like as far as the eye goes that you edited, can you just like copy that eye layer and then move it into the next photo, like for the same, because like you made a lot of adjustments. So like for the hair, like on the rest of this photo shoot, can you copy these layers and then paste them?
Well, if it's on a separate layer, like for example the eye, yes, I can of course move it. I can open a different image, let's say, I don't know, this image, right? And I can take this layer with an eye. Where is it? There it is. There's my eye, there's the shadow, there's the petal, so I can select them all with Shift key and just, you know, drag and drop them like that. When it comes to hair, while you in Photoshop and you haven't closed it, if you go to filter, no, it's not anymore. So there's a thing about Photoshop, it remembers and saves the last filter you applied. So when you do liquify and don't do any other filter, let's say I do go to liquify, sorry, I clicked on something else. Oh no, it's liquify. Anyway, when you go to liquify and do some changes in liquify, Photoshop remembers it. But the thing, if you apply that without closing Photoshop, apply it to another image, because it applies it exactly to those specific pixels that were on this image. So it might not work for another image because there's going to be a different pose or a different person located in the frame. So usually liquify I do for every single image. But usually my approach to photography is one photo shoot, one image. I don't really do serious, yeah, so for me it's not a problem. Yeah, but you can copy layers and apply them to other images, of course. No more questions? Yes?
I'm just curious, where do you get your inspiration from? I saw your Instagram profile and there are a lot of great pictures and imaginations. Where do you get this?
Oh, there's no simple answer to that because inspiration is a very complex process, but I think inspiration comes from within. So you need to kind of like build this visual library, and by that I mean a collection of like experiences and impressions and everything that you see that surrounds you. So I always tell my students that you need to build this visual taste. So just watch art, browse art online, go to galleries, go to exhibitions. And it doesn't have to be only photography because I love contemporary art, I like installations, I follow some digital artists, like illustrations and painters. And I just follow my favorite creatives and I kind of like browse all of that and not really remember, but I remember in the back of my head. And I call it visual library. So in the end, when I see something and something triggers me, I can come up with an idea and it inspires me. And for example, I really love to travel. I love nature. So when I travel, I always look for interesting, unique locations. And those locations very often inspire me. For example, like this image, I went to Death Valley. If you've ever been to Death Valley, they have this spot called Artist's Palette. And that's where they have those colored, they actually, that color, maybe not that color, not that saturated, but they actually have colored hills because different elements, like iron, they oxidize and they create different colors, like cyan, magenta, etc. And that's why it's called Artist's Palette. So I saw it, I'm like, oh my God, this is so awesome. And instantly I thought of an idea of me being an art, like a painter with a huge paintbrush and pretending that I'm coloring those hills with like buckets of paint. Yeah.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Anya Anti. Let's hear it for her. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you so much.